Good afternoon. This is Chapter 10, Lecture B. We'll finish up Chapter 10 today. Okay, one of the big elements to this section is going to deal with Jackson, obviously. Public and private freedom. Public and private definitions. There's going to be a difference between the two parties and the limitations of power. Now, Jackson's term, Democrats during his term, they reduced expenditures, lowered the tariff, killed the national bank, and refused aid to internal improvements and paid off national debt. Well, the best thing they did there was pay off the national debt, but they are essentially going to kill the economy during this period. They believed individual morality was a private matter to the Democrats. Whatever a person did in the private was not public business. Whigs insisted, the rival group, insisted that the liberty and power reinforced each other. They rejected the premise that government must not interfere in private life if it deemed necessary. Many evangelical Protestants supported the Whigs because of this intervention into the private life and individual morality. Now, the public and private freedom, this kind of stems from Jackson's problems with his questions of his marriage, and then the ultimate death of his wife, and if they were married before she was legally divorced and all that. So you can understand why there would be differences there. Now, one of the biggest issues during his presidency is going to be the nullification crisis, South Carolina. In 1828, a tariff of what they called in the South, called tariff of abominations, raised the prices on imported manufactured goods made of wool as well as raw materials, iron. This was meant to help production of American goods. However, claimed the prices benefited the North at the South's cost because the North benefited from this, and claimed they could nullify it, that the federal government was not the law of the land, that they could. South Carolina was controlled by a small, tight group of planters, and this directly affected their pocketbooks. Wanted to reduce the size of the government, or one day it might take action against slavery, because they thought the federal government would one day attack slavery, which they were not wrong in that regard. But South Carolina says we can nullify this law. The age of Jackson III. Now, John C. Calhoun had been a nationalist of 1812, became a defender of Southern sectionalism, and he became the vice president for Jackson. He was elected as vice president in 1828, wrote the exposition and protest in which South Carolina justified nullification. So he's going to try to use this as a power grab a little bit to promote his status and as well promote South Carolina. The ridicule of the Secretary's War life, led by Calhoun's life, angered Jackson at Calhoun. Once again, the private life sector is going to become a part here, as Jackson's wife had died because of ridicule. Calhoun's wife, who was ridiculing the Secretary of War's wife, really made Jackson mad because his wife literally died as part of that harassment. So that's going to cause some alienation between Calhoun and Jackson. Webster-Hayne debates in the Senate over this whole nullification. Webster stated, "Liberty and union now and forever are one and inseparable." A few weeks later, Jackson at a dinner party looked at Calhoun and said, "Our federal union, it must be preserved." Now, many in the South thought Jackson would support this nullification position, and Calhoun thought he would as well. And plus, he was trying to undermine Jackson because let's be honest, Calhoun probably had visions of being president himself. However, when Jackson did that, it completely undermined anything the South was going to try to do at this point. Now, the nullification crisis. It was not purely a sectional issue of nullification. South Carolina stood alone as several southern states passed resolutions condemning its action. In 1832, a new tariff was passed, and South Carolina declared it null and void in South Carolina. Congress passed the Force Act authorizing Jackson to use the Army and Navy to collect customs duties on South Carolina. Henry Clay engineered a compromise with a new tariff of 1833, which basically said the tariff would be reduced over a period of time, appeasing South Carolina, but also keeping the tariffs in place and giving the federal government some face. Now, Calhoun left the Democratic Party for the Whigs, ironically enough, after 1833. Clay, Webster, and Calhoun formed a formidable trio of political leaders, though they virtually agreed on anything but their hatred of Jackson. They basically the enemy of the enemy is my friend mentality. But this whole nullification crisis was over a tariff and the power of the federal government to impose it and the ability for states to nullify it. Ironically enough, South Carolina would be the first state to leave the Union during the Civil War, and they threatened to leave the Union over this whole nullification, though it was avoided. Age of Jackson IV. One of the most, and this is where Jackson is criticized as one of the worst, if not the worst president, and this is the Indian Removal Act. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 provided funds uprooting the so-called 5 civilized tribes, the biggest one being the Cheyenne or the Cherokee. Jackson had changed positions, and the Cherokee sued the government. The Supreme Court and the Indians. Early on, the courts did not help the Indians, did believe it was a federal government problem, not a state problem. However, in Worcester versus Georgia, they declared that Indian nations were a distinct people with the right to maintain a separate political identity. However, Jackson stated, now, let him enforce it, being the Supreme Court justice at the time. Cherokee were forced to move, and the Trail of Tears was commenced. Many as 1/4 or 25% died on their trek to Oklahoma. Thus, Jackson ushers in the removal of a huge people group all the way to Oklahoma. He would try to justify it, saying this was their only hope and all this, but the reality was his pen ultimately led to the slaughter of 25% of the Cherokee Nation. And I say slaughter because they died in the horrible conditions trekking west. Now the Bank War and after. Jackson's biggest battle was to end the bank, the national bank that had been created as Hamilton's plan. Nicholas Beadle headed the bank, and so there's going to be a personal feud between Jackson and Beadle. Snobbish, aristocratic Philadelphian, strong-willed as Jackson despised people like Jackson, and obviously this is going to lead to confrontation. Some wondered if the bank was too powerful in its positions, which there's some argument for there to be had of that. Brittle tried to get the bank renewed in 1832, but it failed at Jackson's veto. His re-election in 1832, though, assured the bank would not be renewed in 1836 when it was permanently going to be, or when it was going to be renewed once again. And at Jackson's hand, the bank will not be renewed. It will be forced to close in 1836. Pet banks, the economy, and the panic of 1837. State banks cheered the free of the national bank's power and its checks that it put in place. Soft money, more paper money was put into circulation, going to cause inflation. And basically banks could operate at their own autonomy. Hard money wanted only to deal with gold and silver currency, so they're going to, basically what you're going to have hard and soft money is inflation will rise, but also at the same time, many people, especially smaller banks, are only going to want precious metal like gold and silver to be traded, thus going to decrease the power of paper money. And then how many farmers are going to keep gold and silver on hand? Let's be honest about this. Jackson removed federal funds from the vaults and put them in local banks, pet banks as they were called. Two Treasury Secretaries refused, and Jackson then appointed Roger B. Taney, who later became the Chief Justice, to enact this operation. Speculation soared and then busted. Jackson issued the special Specia Circular declaring that it would only accept gold and silver as payment for public land. Bank of England, suspicious about the value of American banknotes, did the same thing, and this led to the Panic of 1837, and it led to the Depression that lasted in 1843. And also, Jackson will leave office in 1836, and his hand-picked successor, Martin Van Buren, will come in office and reap the benefits of Jackson's economic plans, which is Depression. Van Buren was elected to replace Jackson in 1836. Money was moved out of the pet banks and back into the Treasury Department, and repealed in 1841 when the Whigs returned to power, but reinstated under President Polk in 1846. Basically what you're going to see here, Van Buren is not going to do very well in office because he is dealing with a depression. The worst depression outside of the 30s depression the United States would face, all ensued because of instability created by the removal of the federal bank. Van Buren could not pull the popularity of Jackson and could not keep the Democrats together. They will start infighting. Obviously, the economy was horrible. The Whigs nominated William Henry Harrison, a military veteran. Not much of a platform. They called him just a common man. John Taylor joined the ticket as to try and grab more votes in the South. Harrison won the election and unseated Martin Van Buren. However, William Henry Harrison gave such a long inaugural address at his inauguration, over 2 hours and a half was what it was stated. In the pouring down rain, he contracted pneumonia and died. Tyler refused to enact several new bills and basically did not much during presidency. He really did not want to be president, but it showed that a president could not govern without a party, and Tyler really went against his party. Now, as we close this chapter 10, you can see in a nutshell, President Jackson did some questionable things. He was a common president, really changed where common people could vote, and the elites did not always have to control the party. However, what you can see here, his ignorance and his arrogance and really his inability to smartly govern led to economic problems, not to mention led to the removal of a people group, and was just a disaster in the end. So as we close, the Age of Jackson, though it did increase rights for many whites, it does have some devastating effects to especially groups like the Indians. As we get into the next chapter, chapter 11, we're going to talk about the peculiar situation, which we call slavery, and that's what we'll talk about in chapter 11. Thank you.